All right, so now let's go through our life cycle of gymnosperms. These are commonly called, or the most common member of this group are going to be the conifers, the cone-bearing plants. Okay, so we still do not have flowers, so no flowers, but we do have seeds. Okay, so no flowers, but we do have seeds. Okay, but why is that important? What are seeds? Seeds are these really, really awesome evolutionary innovations where you have the diploid sporophyte embryo. So you have the sporophyte embryo. So a multicellular sporophyte embryo that is surrounded by food and then it's encased in a protective covering. All right, so again, let's break down the important parts here. So we have the sporophyte embryo surrounded by food and then it's protected. Okay, so it's basically like these baby plant embryos are given a stash of food to get themselves started until they can produce their own leaves and start photosynthesizing on their own. They're given food to do that, to start that process off. And they're given a little bit of protection to keep them safe until environmental conditions are right for them to grow and start producing those leaves. So, unlike what we saw in the seedless vascular plants and in the mosses and the bryophytes, in the gymnosperms and angiosperms, there is no free-living gametophyte stage. So in the spermatophytes, the seed-bearing plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, there is no free-living, independent gametophyte stage. So they are sporophyte dominant. These gymnosperms and angiosperms are sporophyte dominant, and the gametophyte is now contained inside of the reproductive structures. Typically, on a gymnosperm, we're just going to use a conifer as like our general gymnosperm. We have two types of cones. So we have the male cones, which produce pollen, and the female cones, which produce eggs. Now, unlike in the seedless vascular plants, our ferns, and unlike in the mosses, now the male gamete, it's no longer swimming to get to the egg. It's going to float through the air. So this pollen, these are haploid cells. This pollen is haploid. The rest of this here is our sporophytes. These are two in sporophyte stage. The pollen grains that are produced are haploid. So these pollen grains, they are going to float through the wind. They're going to be floating through the wind, and then they are going to land on a female pine cone. So these pollen grains float through the wind. These haploid pollen grains float through the wind. They land on a female cone. And at the base of each of these scales of the cone, they're not actually purple, but I'll draw them purple. At the base of each of these scales of the cone, we basically have eggs. And in order to deliver this pollen to those eggs, so to deliver the pollen grain to those eggs, to fertilize that egg, the pollen grain grows what's called a pollen tube. So we have the pollen cell, and it extends itself out in order to kind of grows an extension that we call the pollen tube in order to deliver that pollen nucleus, that haploid pollen nucleus to the egg. Okay, so our egg is haploid, our sperm is haploid, our pollen is haploid. Then a pollen tube grows, delivers that pollen nucleus to the egg, and now we get our next diploid sporophyte embryo. This diploid sporophyte embryo stays encased at the bottom, at the base of each of these scales. We basically have embryos that are surrounded by tissues. This is kind of what it looks like. So we have the plant embryo. Then in that seed, it's surrounded by food. So it's surrounded by nutritive tissue, mostly fats and starches, things like that. And then, when conditions are right, this cone will open up. A lot of the species we have here in California, the bracts of this cone, the scales of this cone, they don't open up until they've been burned or they reach a certain temperature into fire, right? But these seeds will disperse. They'll land somewhere. This embryo, this diploid embryo, will eventually grow into a tree that will produce its own male and female cones. The haploid pollen will float through the air to find the haploid egg in the female cones. So our gametophyte now, in the gymnosperms, our gametophyte is basically the pollen and the egg. Those are the only haploid stages in this life cycle, and that represents our gametophyte life cycle stage. The dominant and longer lived stage is our sporophyte diploid stage.